the life of a fisherman, it never gets old. So welcome to the show, come on yo, we're going Ike.
Hey everybody, I want to talk to you about the recent Going Ike episode, the South Jersey Slam. And if you live in the state of New Jersey, especially in South Jersey, you know what the South Jersey Slam is. That's a bag consisting of bluegill, yellow perch, crappie, pickerel, and finally, bass. And it was a really fun day on the water for being a wintertime pattern. Wintertime fishing is super tough. And when the day started, we fished a lot of grubs to catch those more aggressive cold water species. The bluegill, the perch, the crappie, and the pickerel all hit small finesse swim bait grub style lures. And I fished, that's that Havoc beach shad, and I would just take it and bite it down, fish it on a jig head, and reel it slow off the bottom. But the funny thing is, in the winter, a lot of times the bass won't cooperate to those faster moving baits. You know, the swim baits, the grubs, the jerk baits, they ignore that stuff and they actually get super low to the bottom. I mean, they almost lay on the bottom in those wintertime conditions. And we used a technique that's really neat, and it's called a micro jig. And, you know, I want to show you a small finesse compact jig in comparison to the micro jig. And this is a traditional smaller jig. This is the Missile mini flip jig, 1/4 ounce, and it's a real small profile jig. Look at it. It's very small. And in normal conditions, that'd be a great small bait to throw. But when it gets brutally tough, like in the winter, and the fish won't respond to anything, this micro jig becomes a real player. And look how small that thing is. Look how tiny that micro jig is. And if you look at it, it's actually a 1/16 of an ounce. It's more like a crappie jig size, but it's got the features of a regular jig. It's skirted, it's got a little fiber guard on it, and it's got a little tiny trailer. And that bait for us was the absolute key in completing the South Jersey Slam. In fact, that little bait caught some giant fish, 3 to 5 pound class fish, on a little itsy bitsy jig. I want to talk to you a little bit about how we fished it. I want to talk to you about a trailer modification, and then we'll look at the line, the rod and reel, and that's real critical. You know, but when they get really inactive in the winter and they're laying on the bottom, ignore everything else, the best way to fish this micro jig is what I call dead sticking. And you know, in the dead sticking technique, you're gonna make a really long cast. The clearer the water, the longer the cast you wanna make. You're gonna let that thing fall on a semi-slack line until it hits the bottom. And then once it hits the bottom, you know, your tendency is you want to jerk it, you want to pull it back, you want to fish it like a regular compact jig. But with this micro jig, don't do it. Think about the fish. They're laying low to the bottom, they're lethargic. And a lot of times in the winter like that, you're not going to believe me, but they do. They're feeding on nymphs and larvae and grubs that live in the bottom. Also little tiny crawfish. That's a big part of their diet in the wintertime. And that's what we want to imitate with this micro jig. We make that long cast, we let it fall to the bottom. We're really not going to move it a lot at all. In fact, a lot of the time we're going to use the momentum of the boat and we're going to use the wind to be our aid to move this bait. Every once in a while, I'll pull in my slack and move it again. If I feel something on the bottom, if I contact a piece of cover, I'm just going to real gently, just so slow, just shake it a little bit. But the key to this bait, this micro jig, is to dead stick it and to not hardly move it at all. So key on that little tiny 1/16 ounce micro jig. You know, on trailers, you want to match a small trailer to the bait. And a little tiny baby chunk, a little tiny grub is a great choice. Or a modification that I make on this micro jig all the time, and it's taking your favorite, what I call broad tail finesse worm, and I'm gonna make a little modification that cuts the bait. And we've got a Berkeley power bait. This is their Pro Jig worm. It's only 4 inches. It's the perfect style bait to fish on a micro jig. And we're just gonna modify that bait to make it fit that compact jig. And if you look at it, it's 4 inches. It's small, it's natural looking. And the first modification we're gonna make is cut the length. And we're gonna cut that down to about 1.25 inches. So we're gonna go ahead and just cut the body right off. I've got a little tiny tail section and of course that broad paddle on the back. And then the second modification is to actually cut that tail. And we wanna cut it in the shape of a V, just like a lot of the crawfish, just like a lot of the larvae that have pincers on the bottom. It's a very natural modification. And I'm gonna go ahead and get my scissors and I'm gonna cut a V shape in that plastic and just pull that middle section out. And if you look, what we end up with is that same bait we started with, and now we've got a beautiful little natural crawl larva cut in that trailer. It's small, it matches perfect to the size of the jig. You know, the last thing I want to talk about is the rod and the reel and the line. Very critical. You know, when they get on the bottom like that and they want it barely moving, action is so key. And because of that, I'm always using light fluorocarbon. 6 and 8 pound Berkeley Trilene, 100% fluorocarbon is a great line to use. On the reel, I like a 20 or 30 size reel with a middle of the road ratio. You want it a little bit slow to force you to slow down, but you don't want it too slow. And then the last piece of equipment is the rod. And a spinning rod for sure is the deal. I like a 7 to 7.5 foot spinning rod. In the show, I was using the Abu Garcia Ike series rod in the 7 feet 2 inch model. It's a perfect finesse rod and it's medium action. And look at the bend on that rod. If you look at it, about the 40% of that rod, the first 40% is real tippy. And that's what you need to make those casts, feel the bite, and set the hook. The backbone of that rod is still there. Listen to me. If you're having a super tough day, it's wintertime conditions and the fish are lethargic and toward the bottom, put away your regular jig. Try one of those micro jigs, modify the trailer, and you're gonna catch some fish too.
When I fish like him, you know I'm fishing hard. You might wanna say that I'm going Ike.